My name is Tom and I love all types of cars, especially turbocharged ones. I also enjoy wrenching and racing, so let's see what we can get into today in the Turbo Garage. In our last episode, to improve our transmission response and performance off the line, we dropped the transmission and added a new higher stall speed torque converter. So with the rear differential and suspension beefed up and our transmission ready for action, we now focus on the business end of the Buick Grand National, the engine. Oh yeah, it's time to make some horsepower. Wait a minute, that's not a horse, that's a Zabronki. I need to see a horse. Show me a horse, please. Well, that's not close enough. Our project plan says that we are maximizing our engine mods. But what does that mean? To explain that, we'll need to go back a few years. About 26 to be exact. Back in 1987, the amount of time that a Grand National remained bone stock and untouched could likely be measured in hours, maybe even minutes. Groundbreaking hot rodders like Kenny Bell were developing easy-to-follow recipes that delivered big and very specific power gains. Check this out. These are some of the promotional materials that hot rod vendors would send out to Grand National owners back then. Let's take a closer look at the Kenny Bell materials. Here we see a flyer for their new high-performance computer chips, which were a big deal back then. This is when the era of computer-controlled cars became exciting, as an owner could add 40 horsepower without even getting their hands dirty. This innovation paved the way for all the amazing plug-in programmers and similar tuning tools that we have today. Next, let's take a look at a Grand National parts catalog. I love reading through this, as the descriptions are raw and to the point. No marketing talk, no BS, just here's the part, here's why you need it, and here's what it'll do. Perfect. On this page, you can see the performance recipe being spelled out. Just add these parts and see these results. Pretty amazing for the time, and it could all be done on a reasonable budget. Today, some of the parts may have changed, but the basics of the Go Fast recipes for these cars generally remain the same. Just look at all this cool stuff. This was way before the advent of the internet, so a catalog like this one that was chock full of first-hand performance data must have been quite a thing to behold back then. Regarding my car, it had most of the proven recipe items in place, but was missing a few key ingredients. So we're simply going to add those items to complement and maximize what we already have. Let's get to work. Many Grand National enthusiasts and parts vendors agree that one of the first modifications that owners should make to the Turbo Buick engine are new valve springs. This is because the stock valve springs were pretty weak, offering up a meager 80 pounds of seating pressure brand new, which usually falls to 60 to 70 pounds when worn. This isn't ideal for a naturally aspirated engine, let alone one that is being pumped full of boost pressure. The solution is a set of new, higher pressure valve springs. I picked up a set of the tried and true Comp Cams 980 springs. By installing these, the car will have better throttle response, will idle smoother, and will gain a couple hundred RPM up top too. It's likely that the increased spring pressure will help harness all of that forced induction fury going on inside the cylinders too. There are a couple of ways to go about doing this job while the cylinder heads are still on the car. I chose to use compressed air to keep the valve supported while swapping the springs. I used my compression tester hose for this job. One end is threaded to fit the spark plug hole, while the other fits a standard air hose quick connect. Once the cylinder is filled with air and the valves are supported, then the valve springs must be compressed. To handle this, I picked up a valve spring compression tool that is specifically made for this job. I'll show you how it works in just a bit. The other method of keeping the valve springs contained involves feeding rope into the spark plug hole. Good thing I always keep some handy. You know, I started with this approach, but I was clearly doing something wrong. You do this job one side of the engine at a time, and I chose the easier side first. More on that later. First, unbolt and remove the valve cover from the engine. If needed, replace the valve cover gaskets while you're in there. Just a quick tip, I like to use cardboard templates to keep track of the bolts and where they belong. With the valve cover off, we can now get a good look at the rocker assembly and the 3 bolts that mount it to the head. After removing those, the assembly lifts right off. Next, I threaded my air hose into the spark plug hole and connected it up to my compressor hose. Don't be shocked if the engine turns over a little bit, as seen here. Now it's time to get down to business. You'll repeat this procedure for all 12 springs, so block out your schedule for the next couple hours or so. First, we bolt the spring compressor tool onto the head over the spring we want to change. Then we use our ratchet to compress the spring, which frees up the valve keepers. I used a powerful telescoping magnet to grab and pull them out. After the keepers are out of the way, then you can release the spring pressure. Now we loosen the spring compressor tool in order to remove the old spring and install the new one. This is a good time to replace the valve stem seals too. The compressor tool gets tightened down again, and then we compress the new spring in order to reinstall the keepers. The keepers may take a little fiddling to get back into place, but once they're all set, release the pressure from the spring and remove the compressor tool. One down, a bunch more to go. Here's a look at an old stock spring compared to the new comp cams piece. The main visual difference are the dampers. The stock one uses an external clip-on damper, while the comp cams unit is internally dampened. With the easier driver's side done, now it's time to tackle the dreaded passenger side. As you can see, it's tight with the AC box, coolant lines, and wiring harness all in the way. Heck, just getting the valve cover out of there is a headache. Yeah, we're not on speaking terms at the moment. I decided to spare you the gory details, but I just took my time and it all went well. All of the springs got changed out and only a little blood was spilled. Next, I'll be spending some time in the old doghouse. No, I didn't make my wife angry. We're talking about the Grand National's upper intake plenum, which does kinda resemble a doghouse. The first step in removing it is to unbolt this vacuum block. Then I loosened the hose clamps that hold the inlet pipe in place and removed that. Next, you can remove the 5 bolts that hold the plenum down. The throttle bracket needs to be unbolted and set aside during this time too. Now you can free up the plenum and remove it. With the intake and throttle body on the workbench, it was the perfect time to give it a good scrubbing. I used a spray cleaner designed for this sort of thing, and a soft bristle brush to loosen up the caked-on grime. This doghouse was filthy. After giving everything a good cleaning, I removed the throttle body so we could make some more modifications. First up was cutting off this Egr port. I used a simple jigsaw with a fine-tooth blade to get the job done. Oh, and speaking of the Egr, I also fabbed up a simple steel Egr valve block-off plate. To get the shape and size right, I traced around the stock Egr valve gasket, leaving the top port blocked off as you can see here. There are block-off plates for sale that completely delete the Egr valve, but they are prone to leaking and blowing out gaskets. This design ensures that we won't have any leaking problems. I then went to work cleaning up what was left of that old Egr port and working on the throttle body inlet. There was a raised area that I ground down to open up the transition from the throttle body into the intake plenum. I didn't go overboard here, as I didn't see the point of doing so with a stock throttle body in place. Someday I can either upgrade to a different plenum or port this one to match a larger throttle body. Here's how it turned out before a final pass with the mandrel-mounted sanding cartridge. Next, I wanted to paint the upper intake to match my valve covers. A couple of years ago, I cleaned those up, painted them low gloss black, and then sanded down the raised fins for a clean, classic hot rod look. The upper intake has these same raised fins, so I thought that would look cool. Here's a tip: when you want a clean edge when masking off a piece like this, tap the taped edge gently with a hammer. This will cut the tape to the edge perfectly. After masking, I sprayed on my tried and true Duplicolor low gloss black engine enamel. After a few more coats and letting it dry in the sun for a while, I used the same technique that I used with the valve covers: a sanding sponge and some elbow grease to bring out the natural aluminum finish of the raised fins. With the plenum done, there's one more thing to do before we bolt it back onto the engine. This is the power plate from RJC Racing. If you've never seen one before, you may be scratching your head a bit. This plate is similar to a good old-fashioned plenum spacer. Its purpose is to evenly distribute airflow to all cylinders through the intake manifold. Where it differs from a basic spacer is that it doesn't add unnecessary volume to the upper plenum, it simply ensures that no one cylinder is getting more or less airflow than another, which can cause knock or other tuning issues. It may look like a restriction at first, but it's not. The shapes don't impede airflow, they manage the airflow. Pretty cool stuff. It's easy to install too, as it simply bolts between the upper plenum and the lower intake manifold. You just place a gasket on the lower manifold, install the power plate in the proper orientation, lay another gasket on top of that, and then reinstall the old doghouse. So here's the finished product. I'm real happy with how all of this turned out. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode where we continue marking items off of our shrinking to-do list. Also, be sure to visit me on Facebook. While you're there, send me some pictures or videos of your car. I'd love to see that. So with that said, thanks again, folks. We'll see you next time.